Many years have passed since those remarkable days when I shared rooms with my dear friend, Sherlock Holmes, at 2121B Baker Street. Time has softened many memories, yet it has never dimmed my admiration for the extraordinary man whose keen mind uncovered truths hidden from everyone else. On quiet evenings, when the fire burns gently and the sounds of the city seem far away, I often find myself thinking of those adventures. Some were filled with danger, others with sorrow, and a few who taught lessons about the strange paths that fate can lead us along. Among them was the curious affair that later became known as the Adventure of the Crooked Man. It was not simply a mystery of crime. It was also a story of love, loyalty, regret, and the long shadow cast by choices made many years before. Even now, as I look back upon it, I remember less the excitement than the quiet sadness that surrounded every step of the investigation. Our life at Baker Street followed a comfortable rhythm that suited us both. Holmes welcomed each morning with fresh newspapers spread across the breakfast table, while I often enjoyed a slower start with tea and a medical journal. The familiar sitting room, warmed by the crackling fireplace, seemed almost untouched by the changing seasons. Shelves overflowed with books, gathered from every corner of London. Chemical bottles stood beside Persian slippers filled with tobacco. Holmes's violin rested upon its chair, ready to fill the room with gentle melodies whenever deep thought required music. Outside our windows, Baker Street carried on with its endless procession of horse-drawn cabs and busy pedestrians. Carriage wheels rattled over damp stones, polished smooth by countless journeys. Gentle rain often drifted through the London air, leaving the streets shining beneath rows of glowing gas lamps. A thin mist softened the outlines of distant buildings until the city itself appeared wrapped in a quiet dream. I had come to treasure those peaceful evenings more than I had during my younger days. After years of medical practice and military service, there was comfort in simply sitting beside Holmes while each of us pursued our own thoughts. We had little need for conversation. A glance or a slight smile was often enough between old friends who understood one another so well. Holmes himself remained a fascinating puzzle even to those closest to him. There were days when he seemed restless, pacing slowly before the fireplace, with folded arms, his sharp eyes fixed upon nothing visible to anyone else. Then there were quieter hours when he leaned back in his chair, violin resting across his knees, drawing gentle notes that drifted through our rooms like distant memories. I had long since learned that his silence often hid the busiest activity of his remarkable mind. London itself never truly slept. Even after darkness settled across the rooftops, distant footsteps echoed through narrow streets. Somewhere beyond the fog, a policeman's city tread blended with the rumble of late carriages, returning wealthy families from dinners or theaters. Newsboys called the final editions of the evening papers before disappearing into quieter lanes. The great city breathed with slow and endless patience. Holmes frequently reminded me that beneath London's calm surface lay countless hidden stories. Behind respectable doors, old secrets remained carefully guarded. Forgotten promises, silent betrayals, and unexpected reunions often shaped lives in ways that few could imagine. The greatest mysteries, he would say, rarely announced themselves with violence. More often they arrived quietly, concealed beneath ordinary appearances. At the time, I believed our current days would pass without interruption. Holmes had recently concluded another demanding investigation, and seemed content to enjoy a brief period of rest. His correspondence had grown unusually light, and even the stream of anxious visitors climbing our familiar staircase had slowed. Hudson, always attentive to our comfort, remarked that the house seemed almost peaceful for the first time in many weeks. Holmes merely smiled at her observation. Peace, however, was seldom a lasting guest at Baker Street. I noticed one afternoon that Holmes had begun paying unusual attention to several newspaper reports concerning events in the county of Surrey. They appeared ordinary enough to my own eyes. A few mentioned gatherings at country houses, while others described military families residing near Aldershot. Holmes clipped several small articles with great care. Before placing them neatly upon his desk, I asked no questions. Experience had taught me that his curiosity often began long before any client sought his assistance. A tiny report overlooked by thousands might later become the very key that unlocked an impossible mystery. The weather grew cooler as evening approached. Rain tapped softly against the window panes, while the fire cast a warm amber glow across the sitting room. Holmes settled comfortably into his armchair, one long finger resting against his cheek as he quietly studied a folded document. Returned to my book, though I occasionally glanced toward my friend, wondering what chain of reasoning occupied his thoughts. At that time I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. The comfortable silence between us was broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional hiss of burning coal. Such moments remain among my happiest memories. There was a sense that no matter how strange the world beyond our windows might become, Baker Street offered a small island of warmth and reason. If you enjoy these quiet recollections of our adventures, you are always welcome to join me again for another Sherlock Holmes case. It was growing late when a firm knock sounded below. Moments later, we heard Mrs. Hudson speaking with someone in the hallway. The measured footsteps ascending the staircase carried an air of purpose rather than panic. Whoever approached our sitting room was accustomed to discipline and responsibility. Holmes looked up from his papers before the visitor had even reached our door. A faint expression of interest crossed his face, the sort I had come to recognize whenever an ordinary evening was about to become something quite extraordinary. I closed my book and set it aside. Neither of us yet knew that the quiet visitor climbing those familiar 17 steps would lead us into one of the most deeply human mysteries we had ever encountered, a case where justice would prove far more complicated than the law itself. Mrs. Hudson opened the sitting room door with her usual quiet grace and announced our visitor. Into the warm glow of the fire stepped a gentleman whose appearance at once suggested long years of military service. His posture remained upright, despite the weariness that rested upon his features, and his movements carried the calm discipline of a man accustomed to responsibility. Holmes rose to greet him with easy courtesy, while I followed his example. Our visitor removed his gloves and placed his hat upon a nearby chair before introducing himself as Major Murphy of the Royal Mallows. His voice was steady, though beneath its controlled tone I sensed genuine concern. The Major explained that he had come not in any official capacity, but as a trusted friend of Colonel James Barclay, whose sudden death had already stirred both sorrow and confusion among the officers stationed at Aldershot. Holmes invited him to take the armchair nearest the fire. The rain continued its gentle rhythm upon the windows, and for several moments the only sound in the room came from the crackling coal. The Major appeared grateful for the warmth, though his troubled expression never softened. He began by describing Colonel Barclay himself. "James Barclay," he said, had enjoyed one of the finest military careers in the regiment's history. Rising from humble beginnings through courage and determination, he had earned the admiration of both his fellow officers and the men under his command. Years of faithful service had carried him through difficult campaigns abroad, where his bravery became widely respected. Holmes listened without interruption, his fingertips lightly touching beneath his chin. The colonel, according to Major Murphy, possessed a commanding presence that naturally inspired confidence. He could be cheerful among friends and generous toward those who served beneath him. His leadership had won loyalty over many years. Yet the major admitted there were peculiar qualities in Barclay's character that few outsiders ever noticed. Although usually confident, the colonel occasionally fell into deep periods of silence. At such times, he seemed burdened by thoughts that he never shared with anyone. These darker moods might last for hours, or even an entire day, before disappearing as suddenly as they had come. His friends had long accepted these changes without understanding them. It was as though the major quietly observed some memory would unexpectedly return to trouble him. Holmes acknowledged the remark with only the slightest nod. The major continued, Colonel Barclay had been married for nearly 30 years to Mrs. Nancy Barclay, a lady admired throughout the military community for both her beauty and her kindness. Even after many years of marriage, she remained graceful and dignified, winning affection wherever she went. The couple appeared, by every outward measure, to enjoy a happy life together. They entertained visitors regularly, supported local charities, and were well known among both military families and civilians living near the camp. Their home, called Lachine, stood within pleasant grounds, not far from Aldershot itself. It was neither grand nor extravagant, but comfortable, elegant, and well cared for. Many believed Colonel and Mrs. Barclay to be one of the happiest married couples in the regiment. Yet appearances, as Holmes often reminded me, can conceal truths that even close friends fail to notice. Major Murphy admitted that while Colonel Barclay seemed deeply devoted to his wife, the affection between them was not always expressed equally. Miss Barclay treated her husband with courtesy and respect, yet there were occasions when her manner became unusually distant. No quarrel had ever been witnessed. No public disagreement had ever disturbed their reputation. Still, sensitive observers occasionally sensed a quiet difference between them that could not easily be explained. As I listened, I found myself wondering whether these subtle changes carried any real importance or merely reflected the ordinary strains that arise within long marriages. Holmes, however, never dismissed such details. He regarded human behavior much as a physician studies symptoms. Even the smallest irregularity could point toward a hidden cause. The major then spoke of Mrs. Barclay's charitable work. She devoted much of her time to assisting a Catholic mission connected with a local church. Along with several ladies from the neighborhood, she frequently attended meetings organized to support poor children and struggling families. These gatherings were modest affairs, filled with practical efforts to improve the lives of others. Mrs. Barclay rarely missed them. Indeed, the evening upon which tragedy struck had begun in precisely that ordinary fashion. The major carefully described the events as they had been reconstructed afterward. On Monday evening, Miss Barclay left home shortly after dinner to attend one of the mission meetings. Before departing, she spoke pleasantly with her husband and mentioned that she expected to return within a few hours. Nothing in her manner suggested unhappiness. Nothing seemed unusual. Colonel Barclay remained at home. The servants later confirmed that the household settled into its normal evening routine. Lamps were lighted. Curtains were drawn against the growing darkness. Rain drifted softly across the garden beyond the windows. The colonel occupied himself quietly while awaiting his wife's return. The mission meeting itself concluded without incident. Several ladies walked together for part of the journey home before separating near their respective houses. Barclay reached Lachine at approximately 9 o'clock. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Major Murphy paused before continuing. It was clear that what followed still troubled him deeply. After returning home, Mrs. Barclay entered the morning room rather than the drawing room. This surprised the servants, for the morning room was seldom used during the evening. She requested that lamps be brought, and then asked for tea. This, too, seemed unusual. Barclay rarely drank tea at such an hour. The maid obeyed without giving the matter much thought. Shortly afterward, Colonel Barclay joined his wife in the morning room. The door was closed behind him. For several minutes, the house remained perfectly quiet. Then everything changed. The servants began hearing raised voices. At first they paid little attention, believing husband and wife were engaged in nothing more than an ordinary disagreement. Such things happen even within the happiest homes. Yet the voices gradually grew louder. Although the words themselves could not always be clearly understood, the servants soon recognized that Mrs. Barclay appeared greatly distressed. Her voice carried an emotion they had never before heard from her. The butler, uneasy at the sound, approached the closed door. Another servant followed. Together, they listened. The colonel spoke in low tones that remained difficult to distinguish, but Mrs. Barclay's replies became increasingly clear. She repeated several short phrases filled with bitterness. Again and again, she accused her husband of something connected with the past. The servants later remembered hearing her say that he had ruined her life. They also heard a name spoken more than once: David. No one in the household knew anyone by that name. No explanation could be found. Then came a sudden cry. It was unlike any ordinary shout of anger. Those standing outside immediately realized that something terrible had happened within the room. They rushed toward the door. To their surprise, it would not open. It had somehow become locked from the inside. The butler called loudly. No answer came. He tried the handle repeatedly. Still, nothing. Meanwhile, an alarming silence settled upon the room beyond the door. The servants hurried outside, then looked through the French windows opening toward the garden. One of the windows stood partly open. The butler climbed through. Inside, he discovered a scene that no one present would ever forget. Major Murphy lowered his voice as he described it. Colonel Barclay lay upon the floor, motionless. A terrible wound marked the back of his head. Nearby, Mrs. Barclay had collapsed unconscious upon a sofa. She showed no visible injury, yet remained entirely unaware of those round her. The room itself appeared strangely disturbed. A heavy carved club, unlike anything belonging to the house, rested near the colonel's body. The key to the locked door could not be found. Despite careful searching, it had completely disappeared. Doctors were summoned at once. They could do nothing for Colonel Barclay. His death had already occurred. Barclay eventually regained consciousness, but the terrible shock left her dangerously ill. She drifted in and out of fever and proved incapable of giving any explanation. As matters stood, the evidence seemed deeply troubling. A husband lay dead. A wife had been alone with him. The room had been locked. The missing key remained unexplained. Even the strange weapon seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Scotland Yard, naturally, had begun its own inquiries, yet many questions refused to yield simple answers. Holmes had remained almost perfectly still throughout the Major's account. Only once or twice had he reached quietly for his notebook to record a single word. When the story ended, he leaned back in his chair and gazed thoughtfully into the dancing flames of the fireplace. Outside, the rain continued to fall across Baker Street, while distant carriage wheels rolled softly through the mist-covered streets. I had already begun forming my own theories, though experience had taught me to distrust first impressions whenever Holmes remained so unusually silent. His eyes rested upon the fire for several moments before he finally spoke. His first question was not about the dead colonel, nor was it about the missing key. Instead, he wished to know everything possible about the mysterious name that Mrs. Barclay had repeated during the quarrel. For Holmes, even a single forgotten name could become the thread that unraveled an entire mystery. For a few quiet moments, after Major Murphy finished his account, no one spoke. The fire crackled gently, sending soft waves of warmth across the familiar sitting room. Outside, rain continued to fall upon Baker Street, while the glow of the gas lamps lured behind the mist upon the windows. Holmes remained perfectly still, his long fingers resting lightly together, his eyes half closed, as though he were listening to thoughts that no one else could hear. I had often mistaken that expression for simple silence. Experience had taught me otherwise. Whenever Holmes appeared most relaxed, his mind was usually moving with remarkable speed. At last, he looked toward our visitor. "You mentioned a name," he said quietly, "one that the servants heard more than once." Major Murphy nodded. "Yes, they were quite certain of it." Barclay repeatedly spoke the name David. None of us could understand its meaning. Holmes asked whether Colonel or Mrs. Barclay had any close friend, relative, or former companion by that name. The major slowly shook his head. "No one within the regiment, and beyond the regiment. I have made discreet inquiries," he replied. "No one has produced any answer." Holmes accepted this without comment. He reached for the folded newspaper clippings that had rested upon his desk throughout the evening. I noticed that several of them concerned the death of Colonel Barclay, though the reports were brief and contained little beyond the ordinary facts already described. "The newspapers," Holmes observed, "have naturally reached their own conclusions." "They have," said Major Murphy, with a weary sigh. "Most believe Mrs. Barclay killed her husband." The words hung heavily in the room. Was I admitted to myself? An understandable conclusion. A locked room, a dead man, a wife found alone with him. Such facts would satisfy many investigators. Holmes, however, never allowed appearances to replace evidence. He gently tapped one finger against the arm of his chair. "There are difficulties." The major leaned forward slightly. "You see them as well?" "I see several." Holmes spoke calmly, not as one arguing against accepted opinion, but simply arranging facts into their proper places. "The missing key troubles me first." Major Murphy agreed. "Every lock requires a key. If Mrs. Barclay locked the door, where is it?" The room was searched carefully. Holmes nodded. "Quite. The police have suggested that Miss Barclay hid it." "Perhaps." Holmes spoke so mildly that I knew at once he remained unconvinced. "If so," he continued, "she accomplished the task while unconscious." The major offered a faint smile. "I thought that argument might interest you." Holmes returned the smile only briefly. A locked room often appears mysterious until one asks a very ordinary question. "What question is that?" "Who actually turned the key?" The major considered this. "The servants believe Colonel Barclay locked the door after entering." "Belief," Holmes replied gently, "is not proof." Again silence settled between us. The fire burned steadily, while distant carriage wheels rolled through the wet streets below. Holmes finally stood and walked toward the window. He drew the curtain back only a few inches and gazed into the London night. "When did Colonel Berkeley last appear cheerful?" he asked without turning. The Major reflected for several moments. "Earlier that very day. Nothing unusual? Nothing. No visitor? None that we know of." Holmes let the curtain fall into place once more. His attention returned to our guest. "I understand that Colonel Berkeley and his wife had known one another for many years. They met when both were very young, before his rise through the ranks?" "Yes." The Major explained that James Berkeley had entered military life as an ordinary private soldier. Through courage, intelligence, and determination, he had steadily advanced until he earned his commission. Such a career was unusual. It inspired admiration throughout the regiment. Berkeley had known him even before those successes. Her father had once served with the regiment as well. Many officers regarded their marriage as a touching example of lifelong devotion. Holmes listened carefully. Their early years together? So far as anyone knows, they were happy. No enemies? None? No financial troubles? The colonel was comfortable. No recent disputes? Nothing of importance. Holmes resumed his seat. "It is remarkable." The Major looked puzzled. "What is remarkable?" "That a marriage of nearly 30 years should suddenly collapse within a single evening." I found myself considering the same question. Could one forgotten memory truly destroy decades of companionship? Could some hidden truth remain buried for so many years before unexpectedly returning? The longer I reflected upon it, the more curious the affair became. Major Murphy continued with several additional details gathered during the official inquiry. The servants had described Miss Berkeley as deeply shaken after returning from the church meeting. Although outwardly calm, she appeared distracted. One maid recalled that her mistress stood for several moments near the front window before entering the morning room, as though gathering her thoughts. Another servant believed she looked unusually pale. No one, however, imagined that anything serious had occurred. She had exchanged polite farewells with the ladies who walked home beside her. Nothing during the meeting itself suggested distress. Holmes asked for the names of those ladies. The Major supplied them from memory. Each had already been questioned. None reported anything unusual until the group separated on the road leading toward Lachine. Mrs. Berkeley then completed the short walk home alone. Only those final few minutes remained unaccounted for. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Holmes requested a map of the district. The Major happened to carry one folded among his papers. He spread it across our table. Together we studied the roads surrounding Aldershot. The military camp occupied a large area nearby. Several pleasant houses stood along quiet lanes lined with trees. Lachine itself rested upon a corner property surrounded by a modest garden. French windows opened from the morning room directly onto the lawn. A narrow path connected the house with the road. Holmes examined every detail with evident satisfaction. "The servants entered through these windows?" "Yes." "And the garden?" "Very soft after the rain." "Were footprints discovered?" "The police found several." Holmes looked up. "Several?" "The servants naturally left many while entering. I refer to earlier impressions." The Major hesitated. "There were reports of additional marks." Holmes' eyes brightened ever so slightly. "What kind?" "The investigating officer believed someone may have crossed the lawn before the servants arrived." "May have?" "The impressions were incomplete because of the wet ground." Holmes remained thoughtful. "Were they examined carefully?" "I believe so. I should like to examine them myself." The Major appeared relieved. "I hoped you would." It had become increasingly clear that Scotland Yard's conclusions failed to satisfy those who had known Colonel Berkeley personally. No one wished to accuse Mrs. Berkeley without certainty. Yet neither could anyone explain the strange collection of facts surrounding the death. Holmes folded the map once more. When does the first train leave for Aldershot? The Major provided the time. Holmes glanced toward the mantel clock. We shall leave in the morning. Our visitor rose, expressing sincere gratitude. Holmes assured him that he promised nothing beyond an honest examination of the evidence. Facts, he said quietly, often possess greater imagination and theories. After Major Murphy departed, Hudson entered briefly to clear away the tea things. Once we were alone again, I expected Holmes to begin discussing possible explanations. Instead, he selected his violin. He drew the bow gently across the strings. A slow, thoughtful melody filled the room. I recognized this habit well. Music allowed his mind to settle into order. Returned to my chair beside the fire and listened in silence. The rain had become lighter now. Beyond the windows, the city seemed wrapped in peaceful darkness. The warm light of the fireplace danced across the familiar furniture that had witnessed so many remarkable evenings. There was comfort simply in sharing that quiet space with an old friend. After several minutes, Holmes lowered the violin. My dear Watson, yes. What impression has this story made upon you? I answered honestly. I confess I cannot escape the appearance against Barclay. Nor should you. His reply surprised me. The appearance exists, but you doubt it. I doubt appearances whenever they become too convenient. He leaned back comfortably. Consider. I waited. A respectable woman leaves home in perfect calm. She attends a charitable meeting. She returns by the ordinary route. Yes, within minutes she is overwhelmed by violent emotion. It would seem so. What caused that change? I reflected carefully. Something happened after she left the meeting. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. The meeting itself? No evidence. The walk home? Far more interesting. I began to understand his direction. You think she met someone? I think nothing. His smile broadened slightly. I merely observe that a quiet walk offers opportunities unavailable inside a crowded church hall. He rose once more and carefully packed a few necessary belongings into his traveling case. His magnifying lens, his measuring tape, a notebook, several small envelopes for collecting evidence. The familiar ritual reassured me. Whenever Holmes prepared so methodically, I knew every object served a purpose that would become clear only later. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Before retiring for the night, Holmes stood once again beside the window overlooking Baker Street. The rain had almost stopped. Fresh mist drifted quietly beneath the rows of gas lamps, while an occasional late carriage disappeared into the sleeping city. Without looking toward me, Holmes spoke in a calm voice. Barclay encountered someone during those few minutes before reaching home. He allowed the thought to remain unfinished. Then he turned toward me. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall discover whom she met and why a single meeting could awaken a memory buried for nearly 30 years. With that quiet promise lingering in my thoughts, we left the fire to burn low and then retired for the night, unaware that the truth awaiting us in Aldershot was older, sadder, and far more extraordinary than either of us yet imagined. Morning arrived. Beneath a sky of soft gray clouds that stretched across London like a blanket of fine wool. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening beneath the first pale light of day. From our windows at Baker Street, I watched tradesmen begin their daily rounds, while milk carts and delivery wagons moved steadily through the waking city. Thin wisps of chimney smoke rose above the rooftops, blending gently into the lingering mist. Holmes had already been awake for some time. When I entered our sitting room, I found him seated beside the breakfast table with a fresh pot of coffee, several newspapers, and the railway timetable spread neatly before him. He greeted me with his usual quiet nod before returning his attention to the map of Aldershot that Major Murphy had left with us. Our breakfast passed peacefully. Holmes spoke little, though I noticed him occasionally tracing the roads around Colonel Berkeley's residence with the tip of a pencil. Every now and then he compared the map with one of the newspaper reports, making brief notes in the margin of his notebook. I resisted the temptation to interrupt. One of the many lessons I had learned during our years together was that Holmes preferred to let his thoughts settle naturally. Questions asked too early often received no answer at all, while those asked at the proper moment were rewarded generously. Soon afterward, we left Baker Street and made our way through the cool morning air toward the railway station. London was fully awake now. Shopkeepers swept their doorways. Clerks hurried along the pavements with leather cases beneath their arms. Newspaper boys called out the day's headlines, though the affair at Aldershot seemed to have surrendered its place on the front pages to newer events. The city possessed a remarkable ability to move forward. Yesterday's great mystery quickly became today's forgotten report. Holmes observed the busy streets with casual interest. "It is one of London's peculiar habits," he remarked, "that while thousands pass one another each hour, very few truly see what is before them." I smiled. "I've often reminded me of that." "And yet," he replied gently, "the lesson deserves repeating." A hansom cab carried us through streets still damp from the night's rain. The horses' hooves struck a steady rhythm against the stones, while rows of gas lamps, now extinguished, stood like silent guardians beside the road. Though daylight had come, a light fog lingered between the taller buildings, softening their outlines. Before long, we boarded our train for Aldershot. Railway travel always offered Holmes an opportunity for uninterrupted thought. Once settled into our compartment, he removed his notebook, but did not open it. Instead, he gazed quietly through the window as London's crowded neighborhoods slowly gave way to open fields and scattered villages. The countryside looked peaceful beneath the overcast sky. Fresh green meadows stretched toward distant hedgerows where cattle grazed lazily. Small streams reflected the pale morning light, and occasional church towers rose above clusters of cottages, surrounded by ancient trees. The gentle rocking of the train, combined with the quiet scenery beyond the glass, created an atmosphere perfectly suited to calm reflection. For some time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I turned toward Holmes. "You will believe the answer lies somewhere between the church meeting and Mrs. Berkeley's arrival home." "I believe," he answered, "that those few minutes deserve more attention than they have received. The police questioned the ladies who accompanied her. They did, and learned nothing." Holmes folded his hands comfortably. "Quite true. Then what remains?" "The final portion of her walk." I considered this. It cannot have lasted more than several minutes. Indeed, could so brief an encounter truly explain everything that followed? Holmes looked toward me with a thoughtful expression. "My dear Watson, the length of an event matters far less than its meaning." He allowed a moment to pass before continuing. "A single sentence has begun wars. A single letter has ended fortunes. A single meeting has changed entire lives." His words settled quietly in my mind. Looking back now, I realize how often Holmes viewed time differently from most people. Others measured events by minutes or hours. He measured them by consequence. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. As our train continued southward, Holmes finally opened his notebook. "I have listed the peculiar facts." He turned the page so that I might read them. The first entry simply read, "Mrs. Barclay leaves home cheerful." The second, "Returns deeply disturbed." Then followed, "Private quarrel. Repeated use of the name David. Old dead. Mrs. Barclay unconscious. Door locked. Key missing. Strange weapon. Possible footprints outside." Holmes tapped the page lightly. "Each fact is trustworthy. The explanations are not." I nodded. He continued, "When explanations fail, one must return to facts." It was characteristic advice. Many investigators became attached to their theories. Holmes never did. He preferred to let evidence shape his conclusions rather than forcing evidence to support them. Our train reached Aldershot shortly before noon. The station bustled with soldiers, officers, civilians, and railway staff, moving calmly about their ordinary business. Uniforms of various regiments added touches of bright color against the otherwise gray surroundings. Military discipline seemed woven naturally into daily life here. Major Murphy was waiting upon the platform exactly as promised. He greeted us warmly and expressed relief at our arrival. "I feared London might delay you." "The railway has been most cooperative," Holmes replied pleasantly. Together we left the station and entered a waiting carriage. As the horse carried us toward Lachine, Major Murphy pointed out several familiar landmarks connected with the military camp. Neat rows of officers' residences stood among carefully maintained gardens. Parade grounds stretched beyond them, while distant bugle calls drifted faintly across the morning air. The entire district possessed an orderly character that reflected military life itself. Colonel Barclay's home lay upon a quiet road bordered by mature trees whose branches formed a pleasant canopy overhead. Even before we reached the property, I understood why the colonel had chosen to live there. Lachine was an attractive detached house built of light-colored brick with climbing ivy covering portions of its walls. A broad lawn extended before the French windows of the morning room, while flower beds surrounded the neatly kept garden paths. Nothing about the place suggested tragedy. Birds sang among the trees. Fresh roses still bloomed beside the entrance. The peaceful appearance made the recent events seem almost impossible to believe. We entered through the front door, where the butler received us with respectful courtesy. The poor fellow still looked shaken. His face bore the unmistakable expression of someone who had witnessed something beyond ordinary experience. Major Murphy introduced Holmes. The servants, it seemed, had already heard of my friend's reputation. Holmes requested permission to examine the house exactly as it had remained after the tragedy. Nothing had been altered beyond what necessity required. The morning room stood ready. Before entering, Holmes paused in the hallway. He surveyed the position of every door, every window, every carpet, and every piece of furniture visible from where he stood. Only then did he quietly step inside. The room itself felt warm. Despite the cloudy day, sunlight filtered softly through tall windows overlooking the lawn. Comfortable chairs stood arranged around a polished table upon which rested several books and a delicate porcelain tea service. Everything appeared orderly. Only one detail hinted at recent violence. A faint stain upon the carpet marked the place where Colonel Barclay had fallen. Holmes removed his hat. For several moments, he simply walked slowly around the room. He examined nothing closely. Instead, he allowed his eyes to absorb the entire arrangement before focusing upon individual details. I had seen this method many times before. He preferred first to understand the whole before studying the parts. Eventually, he stopped beside the French windows. They were open, the butler answered. One stood partly open when I reached the garden, sir. Holmes carefully examined the latch. It showed no sign of damage. He next turned toward the door leading into the hallway. The key. It has never been found, sir. Holmes inspected the lock with quiet interest. He inserted a small instrument from his pocket and tested its movement without forcing anything. After only a few seconds, he withdrew it again. An ordinary lock. Yes, sir. No peculiar mechanism. No. Holmes merely nodded. His attention shifted toward the fireplace. Unlike our own rooms at Baker Street, this fireplace had not recently been lit. Summer still lingered sufficiently for such warmth to be unnecessary. The carved mantel displayed several family photographs. Holmes studied them carefully. One showed Colonel Barclay in uniform during earlier years. Another portrayed Barclay while still a young woman. Her expression struck me immediately. There was kindness in her eyes, gentleness. Nothing in that face suggested violence. Holmes appeared to notice the same quality. Without comment, he continued his examination. Upon a nearby table rested the teacup that Mrs. Barclay had requested shortly before the quarrel. It remained almost untouched. Only a single sip appeared to have been taken. Holmes regarded this thoughtfully. Curious. The butler looked surprised. Sir, a lady requests tea. Yes. Yet scarcely drinks it, the servant admitted. He had never considered the point. Holmes smiled kindly. One rarely does. He crossed slowly toward the center of the room. Please describe precisely what you heard. The butler repeated his earlier statement. Mrs. Barclay's voice had risen steadily during the argument. The colonel spoke much more quietly. Only fragments became audible. Among them were repeated references to the past and the mysterious name David. Holmes asked him to repeat every remembered word. The butler closed his eyes briefly. You coward, he began. Now I know. My life has been stolen. David, you can never make it right. He apologized for remembering no more. Holmes assured him that even incomplete recollections possessed value. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. At last, Holmes approached the French windows and stepped quietly into the garden. The recent rain had left the earth soft beneath our feet. The lawn extended only a short distance before meeting a gravel path bordered by shrubs. Holmes immediately crouched near the window. His attention had settled upon something almost invisible among the damp grass. He produced his magnifying lens. Without speaking, he began following a faint line of impressions leading away from the house. The footprints were old enough to have softened beneath the weather, yet they had not entirely disappeared. I could distinguish little. Holmes, however, moved slowly from one mark to the next, with unmistakable interest. After several yards, he suddenly stopped. His expression changed, not with excitement, not with surprise, rather with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose expectations had just been confirmed. Without raising his eyes from the ground, he spoke almost to himself. So, I waited. There were not one. He examined another impression carefully. Two visitors upon this lawn. The peaceful garden suddenly seemed to hold far more secrets than anyone had imagined. Holmes remained kneeling upon the damp lawn for several minutes, studying the faint impressions with patient care. The recent rain had softened many of their outlines, yet enough remained to reward an attentive eye. He moved only a few inches at a time, his magnifying lens held close to the grass, while the quiet morning breeze stirred the branches overhead. I stood nearby, careful not to disturb anything that might prove important. Major Murphy watched with growing curiosity. "I confess," he said softly, "I can scarcely distinguish anything." Holmes looked up with a pleasant smile. "That is hardly surprising. Nature has already begun erasing the story. We are fortunate that she has not finished." He returned to his work. I now observed what had first escaped my notice. Several footprints belonged, as expected, to the servants who had hurried across the lawn after hearing the cries from within the house. Their movements had crossed one another repeatedly, making the ground appear confused. Holmes ignored those entirely. Instead, he followed a separate line of impressions, approached the French windows from the direction of the road. "They are older," he remarked. "Older than the servants?" I asked. "Only by a few minutes." He pointed toward a clearer mark preserved beneath a low shrub. A heel entered the ground before the others. I bent down beside him. Even then, I found it difficult to see what appeared so obvious to him. The man walked alone? For part of the journey. His answer puzzled me. For part? Holmes shifted several feet farther along the lawn. "There." He indicated another series of marks. "They overlap." At first, I believed he referred to two different people. Then I noticed something even stranger. Beside the human footprints appeared several tiny impressions, unlike anything I had ever seen. They were very small. 4 little marks appeared together, followed by another set, a short distance ahead. The pattern repeated itself, again and again, across the damp earth. Major Murphy frowned. "A dog?" Holmes slowly shook his head. "No." "A cat?" "No." The Major looked increasingly confused. "I cannot imagine what else." Holmes smiled faintly. "Nor can I. Not completely." He carefully measured one of the tiny impressions with a small ruler taken from his pocket. "The creature is remarkably light." "You mean an animal?" "Undoubtedly. But what kind?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued following the peculiar trail. The little footprints wandered freely beside those of the unknown visitor, occasionally disappearing before reappearing several feet away. At one point, the marks reached the flower bed beneath the window, where the soft soil preserved them with surprising clarity. Holmes examined them one by one. "Claws are visible." He spoke almost to himself. "Long claws." I looked more closely. The tiny prints certainly differed from those of an ordinary dog. They appeared longer than they were wide, and the claw marks projected well beyond the toes. Holmes closed his notebook. "I have encountered nothing quite like them." Major Murphy laughed quietly. "I never expected an animal to become part of this mystery." "My dear Major," Holmes replied, "animals often notice truths before their owners do." He stood and brushed the damp grass from one knee. "The important point is not what the creature was." "What then?" "That it existed." He explained his reasoning with the calm clarity I had admired for so many years. Whoever approached the house had not come alone. The unknown visitor had brought some unusual companion. The tiny tracks proved it. Neither the servants nor the police had mentioned such a detail. Yet, once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. We slowly crossed the lawn toward the road. The impressions became less distinct. Ground changed from grass to gravel. Soon they vanished altogether. Holmes appeared unsurprised. "Enough remains." He turned toward Major Murphy. "I should now like to examine the road Mrs. Barclay followed after leaving the church." The Major gladly agreed. Our carriage carried us through several quiet streets, lined with comfortable homes occupied by officers and their families. The military camp lay not far away, though the neighborhood itself possessed a peaceful character. Children played beneath the trees. Gardeners tended flower beds. A milk cart rolled slowly along the lane, while its horse walked with unhurried patience. Nothing suggested that one of the county's most mysterious deaths had occurred only days before. Major Murphy directed the driver toward the small Catholic mission attended by Mrs. Barclay. The modest building stood beside a simple church surrounded by well-kept gardens. Several ladies were arranging flowers near the entrance when we arrived. Holmes asked whether one of the sisters who organized the meetings might speak with us. After a brief wait, we were welcomed into a quiet room overlooking the churchyard. The sister who received us remembered Mrs. Barclay with genuine affection. She described her as generous, gentle, and deeply devoted to helping others. The evening meeting, she assured us, had proceeded exactly as usual. Children had received lessons. Supplies had been organized for poor families. Prayers had been offered. Nothing unusual had occurred inside the building. Holmes thanked her, and afterward, the ladies walked together. They separated, one by one. Mrs. Barclay, she explained, had remained cheerful until the very moment the small group reached the road leading toward Lachine. There the others continued in different directions, while she walked home alone. Did anyone see her after that? The sister reflected carefully. No. Holmes accepted the answer without disappointment. He merely asked to be shown the route. Together, we followed the quiet road beneath rows of tall trees. The distance proved shorter than I had expected. A healthy person could comfortably walk it within only a few minutes. Holmes examined every turning, every gate, every hedge, every point where someone might stand unnoticed. The road curved gently before reaching an open stretch, bordered by low stone walls. Beyond them stood a few scattered cottages. One in particular caught Holmes's attention. Unlike the neighboring homes, it appeared neglected. Its roof sagged slightly with age. The garden had grown wild. Curtains remained tightly closed, despite the daylight. Holmes paused. Who lives there? Major Murphy looked toward the cottage. Strange fellow. Oh? He arrived only recently. Holmes waited. No one seems to know much about him. What sort of man? The major searched for suitable words. Very bent. Bent? His back is badly twisted. I noticed Holmes become unusually attentive. He earns his living, the major continued, by entertaining soldiers with tricks and curious animals. Curious animals? So I have heard. Holmes glanced briefly toward me. Neither of us spoke. The major went on. The children rather like him. He travels with some sort of little creature. Again, Holmes looked toward the cottage. The tiny footprints upon the lawn immediately returned to my thoughts. Surely, no, it seemed too simple. Holmes never allowed coincidence to replace proof. Has anyone spoken with him concerning Colonel Barclay? I believe not. Why? He appears harmless. Harmless. The word lingered strangely in the quiet air. Holmes studied the cottage for several moments. Smoke drifted lazily from its chimney. Somewhere inside, something moved against the window curtain, before disappearing again. Nothing more. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. We should pay him a visit, Holmes said quietly. Major Murphy seemed uncertain. Do you believe he is connected with the affair? I believe, Holmes answered gently, that every unexplained fact deserves its opportunity. We approached the narrow garden path leading toward the cottage. The place possessed an unusual appearance. Though poorly maintained, It contained several brightly painted boxes and cages resting beneath a wooden shelter. Few exotic birds called softly from within. There were signs that someone accustomed to travel had gathered curious objects from many distant lands. The front door stood slightly open. Holmes knocked politely. For several moments, no answer came. Then slow footsteps sounded inside. The man who finally appeared upon the threshold was unlike anyone I had ever met. His body was terribly bent. One shoulder stood much higher than the other, forcing him into a twisted posture that greatly reduced his height. His face, deeply lined by hardship at advancing years, might once have been handsome before suffering had marked it so completely. His hair had turned almost white. Yet his eyes remained remarkably bright. They watched us with intelligence, caution, and the quiet alertness of someone long accustomed to observing strangers before trusting them. In one hand he carried a small wooden box. As he shifted slightly, I heard movement from within it. Something alive scratched gently against the wood. The curious little tracks across Colonel Berkeley's lawn suddenly seemed far less mysterious. Holmes removed his hat with perfect courtesy. The old man returned the greeting. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Holmes quietly introduced himself. The effect upon the stranger was immediate. His expression changed, not to fear, not exactly to surprise, rather to the weary resignation of a man who realizes that the past, after many silent years, has finally come to his door. The old man stood quietly in the open doorway, studying Holmes with thoughtful eyes. His bent figure cast a long shadow across the worn wooden floor behind him, while the soft afternoon light rested upon the little garden outside. For several moments, neither of them spoke. I noticed that Holmes wore his most reassuring expression. He had long understood that people burdened by painful memories were more likely to reveal the truth when treated with kindness rather than suspicion. At length, the old man stepped aside. "You had better come in." His voice was rough with age, yet clear enough that one could hear the traces of an educated Englishman beneath the years. Holmes thanked him, and together we entered the modest cottage. The room was simple but remarkably tidy. Shelves lined the walls, holding curious objects gathered from many distant places. There were carved figures from India, brightly colored fabrics folded with care, brass ornaments, and several unusual musical instruments that I could not identify. Small cages rested near one window, each occupied by an exotic bird, whose soft calls filled the quiet room. The air carried a faint scent of spices, unlike those commonly found in England. Upon a sturdy table stood the wooden box that the old man had been carrying. It moved gently. A moment later, the lid shifted slightly, and a small animal cautiously lifted its head. Its body was long and slender, covered with dark fur that gleamed in the afternoon light. Sharp little eyes examined us with lively curiosity before the creature climbed lightly onto the table. I immediately recognized the tiny feet. There could be no doubt. Those unusual footprints across Colonel Berkeley's lawn had belonged to this very animal. The little creature moved with remarkable speed, had crossed the table in graceful leaps before standing upright for a moment, its pointed nose testing the air. The old man smiled gently. "He means no harm." Holmes watched with genuine interest. "A most uncommon companion. He came from India." I suspected as much. The old man stroked the animal with obvious affection. "I have earned my living showing it to soldiers and children. Most have never seen such a creature." Holmes nodded. "I believe he has unknowingly assisted my investigation." The old man glanced toward him with quiet understanding. "The footprints, precisely. faint smile appeared upon the stranger's weathered face. I wondered whether someone clever might notice them. Holmes did not immediately return to the subject. Instead, he carefully observed the room around us. Several walking sticks leaned beside the fireplace. A few worn books rested upon a shelf. Framed sketches of distant landscapes decorated one wall, many of them clearly depicting scenes from India. Nothing within the cottage suggested wealth, yet everything had been arranged with care. Its owner possessed little, but valued each possession. At last, Holmes spoke. "You have traveled widely." The old man nodded. "Too widely. You spent many years in India." "Most of my life, and only recently returned to England." "Yes." Holmes paused. "I believe your name is Henry Wood." The old man slowly raised his eyes. For several moments, he remained perfectly still. Then he gave a quiet sigh. "So you already know." "I know only your name." The reply seemed to relieve him. "My past has finally caught me," Holmes answered with gentle honesty. "Your past crossed the path of another man." The old fellow lowered himself carefully into a chair beside the fireplace. His twisted back made every movement slow and deliberate. He gestured toward two nearby chairs. "Please sit." He accepted his invitation. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the leaves beyond the open window. The afternoon remained peaceful, and from somewhere farther along the road came the distant laughter of children at play. It seemed almost impossible that this quiet cottage might hold the key to Colonel Barclay's mysterious death. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. For a time, Henry Wood simply looked into the small fire burning upon the hearth. "I have carried this burden," he said at last, "for almost 30 years. His voice had grown softer. "When a man carries sorrow that long, he begins to believe he will die before speaking of it." Holmes remained silent. He understood that interruptions often prevented difficult truths from finding their way into words. Henry Wood continued. "You have come because James Barclay is dead." "Yes, I did not kill him." Holmes answered immediately. "I have never believed that you did." The old man's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I am grateful." He looked toward me. "The newspapers have not been so kind." I assured him that newspapers frequently reached conclusions long before evidence justified them. He smiled faintly. "They always have." After another thoughtful pause, he spoke again. "I suppose you wish to know why Nancy Barclay fainted when she saw me." Holmes inclined his head. "I believe that is where the story truly begins." Henry Wood nodded. "It began when we were both very young." His eyes drifted toward the window, though I sensed he no longer saw the peaceful English countryside before him. Instead, his thoughts had traveled back across decades. "I was once a strong man." He spoke almost as though describing someone else, taller than James Barclay. He smiled sadly. "Better looking, too, if truth be told." There was no pride in the remark, only the quiet certainty of memory. "I served in the regiment with him." Holmes listened attentively. "We were friends." Those simple words seemed to carry great weight. Henry Wood explained that both he and James Barclay had entered military life as young soldiers, with hopeful futures before them. Neither possessed wealth. Both relied upon courage and determination. They shared difficult duties together, faced dangers together, dreamed of promotion together. Life had seemed wonderfully simple. Then there had been Nancy. Even after so many years, the old man's face softened when he spoke her name. "She was the finest woman I had ever known." He looked down at his hands. "And she loved me." The room grew wonderfully still. Outside, a bird sang briefly before flying away. Henry continued. "We intended to marry." I glanced toward Holmes. Neither of us spoke. There seemed every reason to believe we would enjoy a happy future. His smile disappeared. But another man loved her too. He needed say no name. We already knew. James Barclay. Henry nodded. He hid his feelings well. The old man sighed. I believed him my friend. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Holmes quietly asked whether Colonel Barclay had ever openly opposed their relationship. No, never. He congratulated me. The words carried unmistakable bitterness. He wished us happiness. Henry looked toward the fire once more. I believed every word. The years seemed to weigh heavily upon him. I was a fool. Holmes gently folded his hands. Please continue in your own time. Henry thanked him with a small nod. The regiment was ordered to India. His voice became steadier as he settled into memory. We were young, full of confidence. We believed nothing could separate us. He described the long voyage eastward and the unfamiliar world that greeted them upon arrival, the climate, the crowded cities, the endless plains stretching toward distant hills, the strange languages, the brilliant colors, the overwhelming heat. Life in India demanded strength from every soldier. Yet Henry remembered those early years with surprising affection. We laughed often, we worked hard, and Nancy wrote faithfully. Every letter strengthened his hope that marriage awaited his return. James Barclay, meanwhile, remained one of his closest companions. So I believed. Henry closed his eyes briefly. Everything changed during the mutiny. His voice had grown almost whisper-soft. The word itself carried deep meaning for every soldier who had served in India during those troubled times. Entire communities found themselves suddenly surrounded by danger. Communication failed. Small military posts became isolated. Trust disappeared. Fear spread rapidly across the land. Henry described how his regiment became trapped inside a fortified position, together with women, children, and wounded soldiers. Supplies steadily diminished. Every day brought greater uncertainty. The enemy surrounded them. Escape seemed impossible. At last, the commanding officers decided that someone must carry an urgent message requesting reinforcements. It would require extraordinary courage. The journey meant passing directly through hostile territory. The chances of survival appeared very small. Henry volunteered. I was young. He smiled faintly. I feared nothing. The officers accepted his offer. Before departing, he required accurate directions through the surrounding countryside. No one knew the region better than James Barclay. He drew the route. Henry's eyes remained fixed upon the dancing flames. I trusted him completely. Holmes said nothing. The old man's voice slowed. He showed me a narrow path, a safe path. So he claimed. Henry's hands trembled slightly. I followed it. The peaceful cottage had become so silent that I could hear only the ticking of some clock upon the mantelpiece. After many years of writing these recollections, I can still remember that silence. It seemed to hold the weight of everything that had not yet been spoken. Henry finally lifted his eyes. There was no safe path. He paused. It was an ambush. The words settled heavily over the room. I rode directly into waiting enemies. Neither Holmes or I interrupted. The route had been false. Henry spoke without anger now. Only sorrow remained. They captured me alive. He looked toward us with tired eyes that had witnessed more suffering than most men could imagine. And in that single moment, he drew a slow breath. James Barclay stole not only my future, but the entire life that should have been mine. The fading afternoon light entered quietly through the cottage window as those terrible words lingered in the peaceful room, and I realized what had only just begun to uncover the tragic history that had remained buried for nearly 30 years. For several moments, after Henry Wood spoke those heartbreaking words, none of us said anything. The small fire burned quietly upon the hearth, and the faint ticking of the mantel clock marked the passing of time. Outside the cottage, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the nearby trees, while somewhere farther along the lane, a horse and cart rolled slowly toward the town. The peaceful sounds of an ordinary afternoon stood in sharp contrast to the painful memories unfolding before us. Henry remained seated with his hands folded together. Though age had bent his body, I could still see traces of the young soldier he had once been. His face bore the marks of hardship rather than bitterness. What struck me most was not anger, but exhaustion, as though carrying this story for so many years had become a burden, almost too heavy to bear. Holmes waited patiently. He never hurried a witness whose memories came from deep sorrow. At last Henry continued, "The men who captured me believed I possessed valuable information. They questioned me again and again, hoping to learn the strength of our position and the plans of the regiment." He spoke calmly, without seeking pity. "I had little to tell them, and even had I known more, I would never have betrayed my comrades." His refusal brought severe punishment. He described long months of imprisonment under harsh conditions. He was moved from one place to another across unfamiliar country. Sometimes he was guarded by soldiers. At other times he fell into the hands of wandering groups who cared little whether he lived or died. Food was scarce. Clean water was often difficult to find. Illness spread easily among prisoners. Every day became a struggle simply to survive. As I listened, I found myself remembering the hardships I had witnessed during my own military service years later. Yet Henry's suffering had lasted far longer than anything I had endured. He never complained. He merely described events as they had happened. "During one escape attempt," he said quietly, "I fell from a rocky hillside." He touched his twisted shoulder. My back was badly injured. Only then did I fully understand the terrible deformity that had changed his appearance so completely. Without proper medical care, such injuries rarely healed correctly. The strong young soldier who had left his regiment full of hope had slowly become the bent old man now sitting before us. "It was not only the injury," Henry continued. "Years of hardship weakened me. By the time I finally escaped, I scarcely resembled the man who had first arrived in India." Holmes asked gently, "How did you regain your freedom?" Henry smiled faintly. "By patience." He explained that after many years, conditions throughout India gradually became more peaceful. During that time, he found opportunities to work among traveling entertainers and merchants who moved between distant villages. His unusual strength, even after his injuries, proved useful. He learned to care for animals. He learned simple tricks that amused children. He traveled from place to place, earning just enough to survive. Eventually, he no longer lived as a prisoner. Yet returning home remained impossible. I possessed no money, no papers, no means of proving who I was. Communication with England was difficult. The years passed, one after another. At first, Henry believed that someone from the regiment would eventually discover the truth. Then he realized no one was searching. He had been given up for dead. I could hardly blame them. His voice remained remarkably calm. A man missing for years is naturally believed to have perished. The firelight flickered softly across the room. Henry looked toward the little animal sleeping quietly inside its open wooden box. "I acquired Teddy during those wandering years." He smiled more warmly than before. "He became my companion." The small creature lifted its head briefly before settling once again. He frightened some people, Henry chuckled softly. But children usually loved him. Holmes regarded the animal with interest. I believe he belongs to the mongoose family. Henry nodded with approval. Very good. Once helped protect me from a cobra. Holmes smiled. A loyal friend. The best. The old man reached down to stroke the creature gently. I have had few others. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Henry resumed his story. Many years passed before I finally saved enough money to return to England. The voyage home should have filled him with happiness. Instead, he felt only uncertainty. Everything he had once known belonged to another lifetime. Friends had disappeared. The regiment had changed. The young woman who had promised to marry him had surely built another life. I told myself there was no purpose in seeking anyone. He looked toward the floor. I intended to remain unnoticed. After arriving in England, he traveled quietly from town to town, earning his living through small public performances. His unusual animal and stories of India attracted curious crowds. The income was modest. It was enough. Then chance carried him to Aldershot. Henry gave a slow shake of his head. I almost turned back. Something about the familiar uniforms awakened memories he had tried for decades to bury. Yet curiosity overcame hesitation. He wondered whether anyone from the old regiment still lived there. He had no intention of revealing himself. He wished only to observe from a distance. I thought perhaps I might see familiar faces. Instead, fate offered him something entirely different. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You saw Mrs. Barclay. Henry closed his eyes. Yes, he spoke almost in a whisper. It happened only a few evenings ago. He described walking slowly along the quiet road with Teddy resting inside its traveling box. The sun had already begun to set. Several ladies approached from the direction of the church. He paid little attention until one face caught his eye. Even after nearly 30 years, he recognized her immediately. Time had added dignity to Nancy Barclay's appearance, but her features remained unmistakable. I hardly believed my own eyes. He had instinctively spoken her name. She turned. For one brief moment, she stared without recognition. Then the truth reached her. Henry said he would never forget the expression upon her face. Shock, disbelief, then overwhelming emotion. She became so pale that he feared she might collapse. Fearing she would fall, he hurried forward despite the pain in his back. The ladies accompanying her looked equally alarmed. Barclay quickly assured them that she had merely recognized an old acquaintance from long ago and asked them to continue home without her. Once they had gone, she and Henry remained alone beside the quiet road. Neither knew where to begin. After so many years, words came slowly. Henry explained that he first reassured her of one thing. I told her I had not returned to seek revenge. Nancy, still trembling, asked how he could possibly be alive. Henry briefly described his years of captivity. As she listened, her expression changed from astonishment to horror. One question escaped her almost at once. Did James know? Henry answered honestly. He knew. Nancy could not understand. Henry then explained the route, the false directions, the ambush. His certainty that only deliberate betrayal could have placed him exactly where waiting enemies lay hidden. She listened in complete silence. Then she asked another question. Are you certain? Henry replied that during his captivity, he had gradually learned enough about local movements to understand what had happened. The enemy had clearly expected him. Someone had informed them. Someone who knew precisely which path he would take. Only one man possessed that knowledge, James Barclay. Henry said he had never forgotten the map his friend had drawn, nor the confidence with which he had followed it. Nancy stood motionless. She whispered that James had always reported Henry's death with deep sadness. Henry gave a weary smile. A man who carries a guilty conscience often becomes sealed at appearing sorrowful. The old soldier spoke without hatred. He sounded merely tired. Nancy covered her face with her hands. She told Henry that James had never confessed such a thing, not once during their long marriage. She had lived for nearly 30 years, believing that Henry had died bravely while carrying out his duty. The possibility that her husband had deliberately betrayed his closest friend had never entered her mind. Henry gently assured her that he had not sought to destroy her happiness. Indeed, he had intended to remain unknown. Their meeting had been entirely accidental. Nancy lowered her hands. There were tears in her eyes. She asked where he was staying. He indicated the small cottage nearby. Then she made a decision that changed everything. I must know the truth. Henry tried to discourage her. The past, he believed, had already caused enough suffering. But Nancy insisted. She declared that she would confront her husband that very evening. If James is innocent, she said, he will tell me so. And if he is guilty? Henry remembered her answer with painful clarity. Then I have lived beside a stranger. The room fell silent once more. I could almost picture that quiet country road where two people separated by nearly 3 decades of sorrow had unexpectedly met again. Beneath the fading evening light, neither had intended harm. Neither had imagined what would follow. Holmes remained thoughtful. When you left her, he asked, what did you expect would happen? Henry sighed deeply. I expected tears, perhaps anger. I never expected death. Outside, clouds slowly drifted across the afternoon sky. Soft sunlight entered the cottage through the open window, illuminating the worn floorboards and the simple furnishings that surrounded us. Everything felt strangely peaceful, despite the sadness of Henry's memories. At last, Holmes asked the question that had quietly waited since the beginning of the interview. You followed Miss Barclay to Lachine. Henry looked up. Yes. I could not leave matters unfinished. He admitted that after parting from Nancy, he became increasingly anxious. She had seemed deeply shaken. He feared she might confront James Barclay in a moment of overwhelming emotion. Without fully deciding to do so, he found himself walking in the same direction, not close behind, only near enough to ensure she reached home safely. He carried Teddy, as always, in the small wooden box. When he reached the grounds of Lachine, he remained outside upon the road. From there he saw lights appear within the morning room. Then he heard raised voices, drifting through the open French window. Nancy had already begun questioning her husband. Henry hesitated. Every instinct urged him to leave, yet another urged him to hear the answer James Barclay might finally give. He crossed the lawn quietly toward the window. The tiny footprints Holmes had discovered now made perfect sense. I only wished to know, Henry said softly, whether he would admit what he had done. His eyes filled with sorrow. I never imagined what I was about to witness. He lowered his gaze once more. The worst moment of all was still ahead. Henry Wood sat quietly for several moments after speaking those last words. His hands rested upon his walking stick, and his small companion remained curled peacefully inside its wooden box. The afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the modest cottage. Outside, a robin landed briefly upon the garden fence before disappearing among the trees. The stillness of the room seemed almost sacred. Holmes allowed the silence to remain. He understood that some memories could not be hurried. At length, Henry drew a slow breath and continued. As I reached the lawn, he said, the voices from the morning room became clearer. A French window stood partly open, allowing both fresh air and sound to pass freely between the house and the garden. Henry had no wish to spy upon the couple, yet he found himself unable to walk away. For nearly 30 years he had wondered whether James Barclay carried any regret for what had happened in India. Now, by pure chance, the answer seemed only a few steps away. He remained outside the window, hidden partly by the shrubs that bordered the lawn. The rain earlier that evening had softened the ground beneath his feet. Those were the very footprints Holmes had followed. From where he stood, Henry could hear Miss Barclay's voice far more clearly than her husband's. She was demanding the truth, not with uncontrolled anger, but with the deep sorrow of someone whose understanding of an entire lifetime had suddenly been shaken. Again and again, she referred to Henry. Again and again, she spoke of the terrible betrayal that had been revealed only hours earlier. The mysterious name that the servants had remembered was no mystery after all. She had been speaking, not of a man named David, but of the man standing outside the window. The servants, hearing only fragments through the closed door, had mistaken one name for another. Holmes made no interruption. He merely inclined his head slightly, as though another piece of the puzzle had quietly fallen into place. Henry continued. James tried to answer. His voice remained calm, but he could not explain away the truth. From outside the window, Henry could hear enough to understand that Barclay had recognized exactly whom Nancy had met upon the road. There could be no misunderstanding. The past, buried for nearly 3 decades, had returned. Miss Barclay accused her husband of sacrificing his closest friend in order to win the woman they both loved. She spoke of deception, of dishonor, a marriage built upon a terrible secret. Henry himself did not hear every word. He heard enough. Then something happened that none of them expected. James Barclay suddenly looked toward the open window. For the first time, he saw the bent figure standing outside. Henry would never forget that expression. It was not anger. He paused thoughtfully, nor surprise alone. He lowered his eyes. It was terror. The colonel stared as though he had seen someone return from the grave. To him, Henry Wood, and dead for nearly 30 years, now that same man stood before him, alive, changed almost beyond recognition, yet unmistakably the friend he had betrayed. Henry instinctively stepped forward. He later admitted that he intended only to enter the room and bring the painful confrontation to an end. He wished James Barclay to face him directly, nothing more. I never laid a hand upon him. Holmes nodded gently. I believe you. Henry continued. The moment Barclay saw him, every trace of color vanished from his face. He staggered backward. His eyes remained fixed upon Henry with overwhelming fear. For an instant, he appeared unable even to breathe. Then he took another uncertain step. His heel struck the edge of the fireplace fender. The heavy metal frame caused him to lose his balance completely. He fell backward with great force. The back of his head struck the projecting corner of the stone hearth. The sound echoed sharply through the room. Henry closed his eyes as though hearing it once again. It happened in an instant. When Barclay struck the stone, he did not move again. Barclay gave a cry unlike anything Henry had ever heard. She rushed toward her husband. The terrible shock proved too much. Within moments, she herself collapsed, unconscious, beside him. The room became completely still. Henry hurried through the open French window. His first thought was not of escape. It was to help. He knelt beside Barclay. Years of hardship had taught him enough to recognize what I, as a physician, understood immediately from his description. The colonel was beyond help. Death had come at once. Henry then turned toward Nancy. She still breathed. He attempted to revive her, but she remained unconscious. At that moment, he heard shouting elsewhere in the house. The servants had reached the locked door. They were calling for their master, trying desperately to enter. Henry suddenly realized how the scene must appear if he remained. An unknown stranger stood beside a dead man. An unconscious woman lay nearby. No explanation could possibly be believed. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Henry explained that he instinctively picked up the key from the floor. It had flown from the lock during Barclay's fall. Without thinking, Henry placed it into his pocket while preparing to leave. Only later did he realize the mistake. The servants were almost inside. They panicked. He quietly admitted that after so many years spent avoiding questions and suspicion, the old habit of disappearing before authorities arrived had become almost instinctive. He climbed back through the French window and crossed the lawn. Teddy followed him faithfully. Only after reaching the road did he discover the missing key still resting in his pocket. "I kept it." His voice was filled with regret. "I feared that returning it would only make matters worse." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. That single mistake created the appearance of murder. Henry nodded sadly. "I know." The little mongoose stretched lazily before curling once more into a comfortable position. It seemed impossible that such a harmless creature had unintentionally become one of the principal clues in a famous investigation. Holmes smiled faintly toward the animal. "You have been a bitter witness than many men." Henry allowed himself the first genuine smile since we had entered the cottage. "He has always been faithful." The room grew quiet again. Outside, the afternoon had begun its slow journey toward evening. Golden light rested upon the leaves beyond the window, while distant church bells marked the passing hour. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Holmes finally rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window. He remained there for a moment, looking out across the peaceful garden. When he turned back, his expression carried neither triumph or excitement, only understanding. "My dear Miss Wood," he said gently, "you have committed no murder." Henry lowered his head. "I have often prayed that someone might one day believe that. I do." Holmes spoke with quiet certainty. "The medical evidence will support your account." He explained his reasoning with characteristic clarity. Colonel Barclay's fatal injury was entirely consistent with an accidental fall against the sharp stone edge of the fireplace. There had been no need for another person to strike him. Indeed, the strange club discovered near the body had likely fallen from Henry's own collection when he entered the room. It had never been used as a weapon at all. The missing key, though unfortunate, merely complicated what was already a deeply confusing scene. Every unexplained fact now possessed a natural explanation. The mysterious footprints belonged to Henry and Teddy. The locked door resulted from the key being accidentally carried away. The violent quarrel arose from Nancy Barclay's sudden discovery of her husband's betrayal. The colonel's death came not from an attack, but from the overwhelming shock confronting the man he believed he had condemned to death decades earlier. Piece by piece, the mystery had quietly dissolved. Holmes asked one final question. "Mrs. Barclay seen you since that evening?" Henry slowly shook his head. "No, I have remained here." He looked toward the fading sunlight. "I thought perhaps the police would eventually find me. You made no attempt to leave. What purpose would there be?" His answer carried the quiet dignity of a man who had grown weary of running from the past. Holmes walked back toward the fireplace. "I do not believe the law has anything to fear from you." Henry smiled sadly. "The law has already taken enough years from me. Holmes offered no argument. Some sorrows lay beyond the reach of legal judgments. As we prepared to leave the cottage, Henry carefully lifted Teddy into its wooden traveling box. The little animal disappeared inside with practiced ease. The old soldier placed the lid gently in position before reaching for his walking stick. He accompanied us to the door. The peaceful lane outside lay bathed in the warm light of late afternoon. For a moment, Holmes paused upon the threshold. "I believe," he said quietly, "that your long silence is nearly at an end." Henry looked toward the distant military camp, its rooftops just visible above the trees. "So many years," he murmured, "so many lives changed by one act of jealousy." His words lingered in the still air as we began the walk back toward Lachine, where one final duty remained, for the truth of the crooked man could finally be brought into the light. We left Henry Wood's cottage in thoughtful silence. The quiet country lane stretched peacefully before us, bordered by old hedgerows and tall trees whose leaves whispered softly in the afternoon breeze. The warm sunlight that had broken through the clouds now rested gently upon the fields beyond, giving the entire landscape a calm beauty that seemed strangely distant from the sorrowful tale we had just heard. Neither Holmes nor I spoke for several minutes. Major Murphy, who had accompanied us throughout the visit, appeared deeply moved. Like myself, he had known Colonel Berkeley only as a respected officer whose reputation had remained untarnished for decades. To learn that the foundations of his life might have rested upon a terrible betrayal was difficult to accept. At last, the Major broke the silence. "I scarcely know what to think." Holmes walked with his hands folded behind his back. "That is often the wisest beginning." The Major looked toward him. "You believe every word Mr. Wood has told us?" Holmes answered without hesitation, "I do. Entirely." Certainty in his voice surprised even me. Many times I had watched Holmes reserve judgment until every possible question had been answered, yet now he spoke with complete confidence. Perhaps he noticed my curiosity, for after a short distance he turned toward us both. "A truthful account," he said, "possesses a certain harmony." Major Murphy appeared puzzled. Holmes continued, "When facts gather from entirely different sources fit together naturally, one may trust them." He then reviewed the evidence in the calm, orderly manner that had so often amazed me during our years together. Mrs. Berkeley had attended the church meeting in perfectly ordinary spirits. On her walk home, she unexpectedly encountered Henry Wood, whom she had believed dead for nearly 30 years. During their conversation, she learned, for the first time, that the man she had married had almost certainly betrayed his closest friend. Shaken to the very depths of her heart, she returned directly home. Her unusual request for tea now became perfectly understandable. She had entered the morning room, not because she wished for refreshment, but because she needed a private place in which to gather her thoughts before speaking with her husband. The untouched cup upon the table reflected a troubled mind. She had scarcely tasted it. Holmes spoke gently, as though arranging simple pieces of a puzzle rather than discussing a tragedy. When Colonel Berkeley entered the room, Mrs. Berkeley confronted him with knowledge he had never expected anyone to possess. Major Murphy nodded slowly. His past had finally returned. Exactly. The mysterious name overheard by the servants also became clear. They had not accurately heard every word spoken through the closed door. Mrs. Berkeley had repeatedly referred to Henry Wood. Fragments of the conversation had reached the hallway imperfectly, leading listeners to mistake one name for another. Such misunderstandings were remarkably common. The servants had faithfully repeated what they believed they had heard. Their honesty had never been in question, only their certainty. Holmes paused briefly before continuing. The open French window invited another witness, Henry Wood himself. He had not entered the house intending violence. Indeed, every action afterwards supported his account. He rushed toward the fallen colonel. He attempted to assist Mrs. Barclay. Only the approaching servants caused him to flee. The missing key, though unfortunate, proved nothing more than a frightened man's thoughtless mistake. It was an explanation so simple that I found myself wondering why none of us had recognized it sooner. Holmes smiled faintly. Simple explanations often arrive last. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. We reached Lachine once again during the late afternoon. The house stood as peacefully as before, its garden bright beneath the lowering sun. The quiet beauty of the place seemed almost untouched by recent events. Inside, the servants welcomed Major Murphy respectfully. Holmes requested permission to examine one final object. The carved club still remained where the police had left it after completing their preliminary investigation. It rested upon a small table in another room. I lifted it carefully. The weapon appeared both heavy and unusual. Its handle had been carved with figures unlike anything commonly seen in England. Holmes accepted it from my hands. He turned it over thoughtfully. As I suspected, Major Murphy looked surprised. "You have seen one before?" "Something very similar." Holmes explained that such clubs were sometimes brought home by soldiers returning from India. Many served as souvenirs rather than practical weapons. He pointed toward faint traces of dust upon one side. "It has been resting among other curiosities for some time." The Major examined it closely. "You believe Mr. Wood carried it accidentally?" "I believe it belonged to him." Holmes smiled slightly. "He probably picked it up without conscious thought when entering the room." Henry had indeed mentioned carrying various unusual objects during his performances. The carved club had likely accompanied him for years. Dropped during the confusion, it naturally appeared suspicious when later discovered beside the body. Another mystery quietly disappeared. We next examined the fireplace. Holmes crouched beside the stone hearth where Colonel Barclay had received his fatal injury. The projecting corner remained exactly where Henry had described it. Its edge was firm enough that a heavy backward fall could easily produce the terrible wound observed by the physicians. Holmes measured its height before rising once more. The medical evidence should leave little room for doubt. As a doctor, I found myself agreeing completely. The injury required no blow from another person. An accidental fall against that sharp edge sufficiently explained everything. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Major Murphy remained thoughtful. "There is one matter I still struggle to accept." Holmes looked toward him encouragingly. "The Colonel's fear. You find it excessive?" "Surely even a guilty man would not die merely from seeing someone he believed dead." Holmes considered the question carefully before answering. "There are moments when the mind exerts extraordinary influence over the body." He spoke quietly, almost as though giving a medical lecture. "A healthy man may survive terrible wounds through determination. Another may collapse beneath overwhelming emotional shock." I remembered similar observations from my own medical experience. Holmes continued. "For nearly 30 years, Colonel Barclay believed Henry Wood had died because of his betrayal. He buried that knowledge beneath a successful career, a respected marriage, an honorable reputation. No one questioned him. No one suspected him. The burden remained hidden until one evening it suddenly stood alive before him. The image lingered powerfully in my imagination. To James Barclay, Henry Wood must indeed have appeared almost like a ghost, returned from another world." Holmes concluded gently. Guilt can become a far more powerful enemy than any living man. Major Murphy lowered his head. I believe you are right. The late afternoon slowly gave way toward evening. Golden sunlight entered through the tall windows, filling the morning room with a quiet warmth that contrasted sharply with the sorrowful memories attached to it. Holmes remained standing near the fireplace. His attention wandered briefly across the familiar furnishings, the untouched teacup, the comfortable chairs, the peaceful garden visible through the French windows. Everything now appeared perfectly ordinary. It was strange how understanding transformed a place. Hours earlier, the room had seemed filled with impossible mysteries. Now every object possessed a natural explanation. The locked door, the missing key, the footprints, the quarrel, the strange weapon, even the cries heard by the servants. Nothing supernatural remained, only human sorrow. Holmes finally turned toward Major Murphy. There remains one important consideration: the law. The Major sighed quietly. Yes. What should become of Mrs. Barclay? Holmes reflected for several moments before replying. I doubt any jury would regard her as responsible, nor Henry Wood. The Colonel's death resulted from accidental injuries. No evidence supports deliberate violence. Major Murphy looked relieved. The police will require a full account. They shall have one. Holmes promised to prepare a careful statement containing every relevant fact. He would include Henry Wood's testimony, the physical evidence observed at Lachine, and his own conclusions regarding the fatal fall. Nothing more, nothing less. He never embellished evidence. Facts spoke best when allowed to stand alone. As we prepared to leave the house, I glanced once more toward the peaceful garden. The footprints that had first attracted Holmes's attention had already begun disappearing beneath the changing weather. Soon they would vanish completely. Nature, as Holmes had observed earlier, was steadily erasing the story. Fortunately, enough had remained. Outside, evening settled softly across Aldershot. Gas lamps flickered into life one by one along the quiet roads. Families returned home after the day's duties. Soldiers walked calmly through the streets in small groups, laughing together without knowing that one of their regiment's oldest secrets had finally come to light. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. As our carriage carried us back toward the railway station, I found myself thinking less about mystery than about time. Nearly 30 years had passed between Henry Wood's betrayal and his unexpected meeting with Nancy Barclay. During those years, entire lives had been shaped by a single act of jealousy. One man had gained success, another had endured suffering beyond imagination. One woman had lived within a marriage built upon a truth hidden from her. And yet, despite all those passing years, the truth had quietly survived. It had waited patiently until chance placed the right people upon the same quiet road at the same moment. Holmes, gazing thoughtfully through the carriage window, finally spoke. My dear Watson, yes, there are cases solved by observation, others by logic. He watched the fading sunlight beyond the fields. And then there are those solved simply because the past refuses to remain buried forever. His words stayed with me throughout our journey back to London, though I sensed that one final chapter still remained before this melancholy affair could truly be laid to rest. Our journey back to London, evening train carried us gently through the peaceful countryside, while the last rays of sunlight slowly disappeared beyond distant hills. Fields gave way to small villages, and villages actually surrendered to the growing outskirts of the great city. Inside our railway compartment, only the soft rhythm of the wheels upon the rails disturbed silence. Holmes sat opposite me, with his eyes half closed. To anyone who did not know him well, He might have appeared asleep. I understood better. His remarkable mind was arranging every detail of the case into its proper place, ensuring that no fact had been overlooked and no conclusion rested upon uncertain ground. For my own part, I found my thoughts returning again and again to Henry Wood. Few men had suffered more cruelly at the hands of fortune. In the space of a single day, he had lost the woman he loved, his closest friend, his future, and nearly his life. The years that followed had bent his body, stolen his youth, and carried him far from his homeland. Yet when fate unexpectedly returned him to England, he had not come seeking revenge. That, above all, remained with me. He had hoped only to live quietly. The tragedy at Lachine had been born not from violence, but from an accidental meeting between people whose lives had once been closely joined. The quiet motion of the train seemed perfectly suited to such reflections. After a considerable time, Holmes opened his eyes. "There is one final point, Watson." I looked toward him. "The lesson?" He smiled faintly. "The lesson." Holmes had never enjoyed moral speeches, nor did he believe detectives should become judges of character. Yet every so often, a case revealed something about human nature that deserved thoughtful consideration. "This affair," he said quietly, "began long before anyone imagined it had." He explained that most people would remember only Colonel Berkeley's sudden death. Newspapers would speak of a mysterious locked room. They would describe missing keys, strange footprints, and a curious little animal crossing a garden. Readers would delight in the puzzle. Few would pause to consider the true beginning. The mystery, Holmes continued, did not begin at Lachine. It began nearly 30 years earlier. With jealousy, I reflected upon those words. James Berkeley had once possessed everything that an ambitious young soldier desired, except the affection of Nancy Devoy. Instead of accepting disappointment with dignity, he had chosen another path. One act of betrayal had altered 3 lives forever. Henry Wood lost his freedom. Nancy lost the future she had expected. James Berkeley gained success, but never peace. Holmes rested one hand upon the window frame. "Guilt," he observed, "is a patient companion. It may remain silent for years, but it rarely leaves entirely." As I considered Colonel Berkeley's occasional periods of unexplained melancholy, described by Major Murphy at the beginning of our investigation, everything became clear. Those dark moods had never been random. They were the quiet return of memories he could never completely silence. His outward success had hidden an inward struggle, known only to himself. The years had never truly freed him from what he had done. At that time I could not yet understand how deeply this case would remain with me. When we reached Baker Street later that evening, Mrs. Hudson welcomed us with her usual warmth. The familiar comfort of our sitting room, the cheerful glow of the fireplace, and the comforting scent of fresh tea provided a gentle contrast to the sadness of previous days' discoveries. London carried on exactly as it always had. Carriages still rolled along Baker Street. Gas lamps glowed softly through the gathering mist. Footsteps echoed beyond our windows. The great city never paused for the sorrows of individual lives. Holmes removed his coat and settled comfortably into his familiar armchair. Hudson soon brought tea, and for a while neither of us discussed the case. The quiet atmosphere itself seemed to invite reflection rather than conversation. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead in future adventures. Oh, this particular mystery had now reached its peaceful conclusion. The following morning Holmes prepared a careful written account for the proper authorities. As always, he included only those facts that could be honestly supported by evidence. He described Henry Wood's history, He explained the accidental meeting upon the country road. He accounted for the mysterious footprints, the missing key, the open French window, and the fatal injury caused by Colonel Berkeley's fall against the stone hearth. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was concealed. Truth required no decoration. The authorities accepted Holmes's explanation after reviewing both the medical findings and Henry Wood's testimony. No evidence existed to suggest murder. Colonel Berkeley's death was recognized as the tragic consequence of an accidental fall brought about by overwhelming emotional shock. The terrible appearance of the scene had misled everyone at first. Once properly understood, however, every unexplained detail found its rightful place. Berkeley gradually recovered from the terrible ordeal that had overcome her. Although the shock left lasting sadness, she was spared the greater burden standing trial for a crime she had never committed. I often wondered how she spent the years that followed. To discover, after nearly 3 decades of marriage, that the man one trusted had built his happiness upon another's suffering must surely have been a sorrow beyond easy description. She deserved compassion rather than judgment. As for Henry Wood, I learned that he chose to continue living quietly, asking for neither recognition nor sympathy. He sought no reward. He demanded no punishment for the man who had wronged him. Indeed, James Berkeley had already faced the harshest judgment possible. He had lived for 30 years beneath the weight of his own conscience. Holmes himself rarely spoke of the affair afterward. When he did, it was never to celebrate another successful investigation. Instead, he regarded it as one of those uncommon cases in which understanding human character proved far more important than discovering physical evidence. "The footprints," he once remarked to me, "led us to the man. The past explained everything else," was a simple observation, yet it perfectly summarized the investigation. As I write these recollections many years later, I realize that the case has remained vivid in my memory, not because of its unusual clues, but because of the people whose lives became so deeply intertwined. There was James Berkeley, a brave soldier whose single act of jealousy destroyed the peace he later sought through honor and achievement. There was Henry Wood, whose strength carried him through hardships that would have broken many stronger men, yet who returned home without bitterness, despite everything he had endured. And there was Nancy Berkeley, who spent most of her life believing one story only to discover another in the space of a few heartbreaking moments. Each of them reminds us that outward appearances rarely reveal the whole truth. Holmes often said that every person carries an unseen history. After this adventure, I understood his meaning more clearly than ever before. Many respectable faces conceal old regrets. Many quiet hearts carry forgotten grief. Many ordinary evenings become unforgettable because of decisions made long ago. The adventure of the crooked man taught me that justice and compassion are not always opposites. The law seeks facts. Compassion seeks understanding. The finest judgments are those that leave room for both. As for Sherlock Holmes, his remarkable gift lay not merely in noticing footprints or hidden clues, but in seeing people as they truly were. Where others found only suspicion, he searched patiently for truth. Where others hurried toward easy conclusions, he allowed evidence to speak for itself. It was this habit, more than any extraordinary talent, that made him the greatest consulting detective the world has ever known. Even now, when I think back upon those evenings beside the fire at Baker Street, I remember not only Holmes's brilliance, but also his quiet humanity. Beneath his sharp reasoning lived deep respect for justice, tempered always by mercy when mercy was deserved. The flames would dance gently within the fireplace as London settled into another peaceful night beyond our windows. The violin rested nearby. Newspapers lay folded upon the table. Hudson moved quietly about the house below. Outside, carriage wheels echoed softly through the mist, while the warm glow of the gas lamps stretched along Baker Street. Those simple moments remain among my most treasured memories. The mysteries have long since passed into history. The voices of many dear friends have fallen silent. Yet, whenever I recall those remarkable days, I remember them with gratitude, for I was privileged to witness not only the extraordinary powers of Sherlock Holmes, but also the enduring strength of truth, patience, and forgiveness. Some mysteries end with the arrest of a criminal. Others end with a better understanding of the human heart. This was one of the latter. And so, as the fire burns low and another memory finds its resting place upon these pages, I close this account with the same quiet satisfaction that often followed our evenings at Baker Street. The world will always hold secrets. Some hide in shadows, others sleep quietly within the past, waiting for the day when truth gently awakens them. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.